Something goes wrong. The energy in the room shifts. People around you start to tighten or spiral or freeze, and something inside you does the opposite. You get quieter, clearer, more focused. If that's a feeling you recognize, there's a good chance you're the kind of person whose nervous system responds to crisis differently than most. And psychology has a compelling explanation for why some people are wired this way. Because people who stay calm when others panic aren't suppressing anything, or detached, or secretly indifferent to what's happening. They're often running a very specific internal process under pressure, one that most people around them can't quite see and frequently misunderstand. This doesn't mean there's an absence of feeling. People in this category often feel a great deal. They just feel it on a different timeline than the crisis itself, and understanding that distinction changes how the whole pattern reads. You might recognize this in yourself immediately, or you might be picturing someone you know, the person who, when something goes wrong, becomes the steadiest presence in the room. The one everyone instinctively looks to without quite knowing why. There's a particular experience that people in this category tend to share, and it starts in small moments long before any real crisis arrives. You're in a situation that's going sideways, a delayed flight, a tense disagreement, a plan that's falling apart at the last minute, and while the people around you are visibly flustered or frustrated, something different happens inside you. There's almost a settling, a narrowing of focus. The noise around you seems to recede slightly, and what's left is a very clear sense of what's actually happening and what needs to happen next. It's not that you don't feel anything, it's that whatever you're feeling doesn't seem to take over the operational part of your mind. The emotion and the function seem to run on separate tracks, and in high-pressure moments, the function steps forward while the emotion stays present but quiet, somewhere in the background. What's interesting is that this capacity often goes entirely unremarked upon in ordinary life. It only becomes visible when things go wrong. And then, suddenly, you're the person everyone looks to, the one who gets asked, "What should we do?" The one who's handed the problem, often without ceremony, simply because something in your manner communicated that you could hold it. Researchers who study how people respond to pressure have noticed something consistent. People vary significantly in the point at which stress tips cognitive functioning from clear to reactive. For most people, a crisis-level situation activates the fight, flight, or freeze response. Thinking narrows, emotion spikes. The brain essentially trades precision for speed because in a survival context, speed is what matters. But for some people, this tipping point is calibrated differently. The same level of situational pressure that sends other nervous systems into reactive mode actually sharpens their focus rather than scattering it. The crisis becomes, in a neurological sense, organizing rather than disorganizing. The brain reads the elevated stakes and moves toward clarity instead of away from it. This isn't usually learned in adulthood. It's a baseline pattern that shows up early and consistently, in the child who becomes oddly calm during a family emergency, in the teenager who handles a frightening situation with a composure that surprises the adults around them, in the adult who later gets told by colleagues or partners that they're unusually steady in difficult moments. The pattern was always there. The circumstances just kept confirming it. It shows up in some very specific versions of ordinary life. It's possible that when someone near you starts to panic, in traffic, in a difficult conversation, during a medical scare, something in you moves toward them rather than away. Not out of obligation, out of something more instinctive. You find yourself lowering your voice, slowing down, becoming the thing the situation seems to need, not because you decided to, because it happened before the decision. Or maybe you've noticed that you tend to be at your best when the stakes are highest, that a high-pressure deadline or an unexpected problem doesn't produce the spiral it seems to produce in others. It produces a version of you that's more focused, more efficient, more present than the version that shows up on an ordinary Tuesday. There's something about urgency that clarifies rather than clouds. Or there's the experience of being the one who makes the call. When something genuinely goes wrong, a real emergency, a situation that requires immediate action, while others are still absorbing what happened, you're already moving, dialing the number, organizing the next step, and afterward, sometimes days later, someone says, "You were so calm during that." And you almost don't know how to respond because from the inside it didn't feel like calm. It just felt like what needed to happen. Or there's the more private version of this, the experience of going home after a crisis and feeling the emotion arrive then, safely, after the fact. The hands that shake slightly only once things are resolved. The tiredness that sets in when there's nothing left to manage, as if the nervous system held everything in place until it was no longer needed, and then quietly released. The psychological explanation for why some people are built this way involves something that researchers who study emotional regulation have observed consistently. People who remain functional under pressure have often developed a kind of separation between emotional experience and emotional expression, not in a repressive sense, but in the sense that their internal state and their external behavior can operate somewhat independently during acute stress. Most people experience emotion and expression as closely coupled. They feel the fear, and the fear is visible. They feel the panic, and the panic shapes what they do. For people who stay calm under pressure, this coupling seems to loosen during high-stakes moments. The emotion is still registering. They know what's happening, they feel the weight of it, but the behavioral response doesn't take its cues from the emotional intensity. It takes its cues from what the situation actually requires. This isn't coldness. It isn't the absence of feeling. It's a kind of internal architecture that routes the two things differently, especially when the pressure is high. And understanding this distinction matters because people who stay calm in a crisis are frequently misread as not caring, as disconnected, as somehow less invested than the people around them who are visibly upset. That interpretation is almost always wrong. The calm is often coexisting with a very full interior. It just doesn't announce itself. There's a deeper pattern worth naming here because it appears consistently in people with this profile. People who stay calm when others panic often developed this capacity in environments where it was genuinely needed, where the adults around them were not always the regulated ones, where someone had to hold the steadiness in the room, and where that someone eventually became them. This isn't always a story with dramatic edges. It doesn't require a chaotic childhood or a traumatic history. Sometimes it's simply a household where one person's anxiety was high enough that another person's quiet steadiness became the counterbalance. And that role, rehearsed early and often, becomes a feature of how the nervous system learned to respond. It's also worth noting that people who developed calm as a response to someone else's anxiety sometimes have a complicated relationship with their own emotions in quieter moments. The skill that serves them so well in a crisis, decoupling feeling from function, can, outside of crisis, make it harder to access what they're actually carrying. Some people watching this may recognize the strange experience of being completely capable in an emergency and then not quite knowing what to do with themselves when everything is fine. The absence of urgency that should feel like relief can sometimes feel more like a kind of low-level restlessness, as if the system is still waiting to be needed. This is the shadow side that rarely gets talked about because, from the outside, staying calm in a crisis looks straightforwardly like a strength, and it is. But it also means that certain people spend a significant portion of their lives being the resource rather than being resourced. Being the steady one, the one who holds things together, the one people come to. And that role, however natural it feels, has a weight to it that doesn't always get acknowledged. The person who never visibly panics is rarely asked if they're okay. The assumption is built into the presentation. They're fine. They're always fine. They're the one who holds things when nothing is fine. And so the check-in goes to someone else. The care gets distributed toward the people who showed their need and away from the person who didn't. Not because anyone was unkind, but because the calm read as proof that it wasn't necessary. People who stay calm in chaos often aren't less emotional than the people around them. They're differently organized. The feeling is there. It just moves on a different schedule than the crisis does. And that difference, which looks like detachment from the outside, is actually one of the most useful things a nervous system can do. So the next time you notice yourself becoming clearer and more focused, exactly when everyone around you is starting to lose their footing, it might not mean you're detached or unfeeling or somehow failing to respond normally to difficult circumstances. It might simply mean your mind is wired for stability under pressure. For the kind of grounded presence that becomes the thing a room holds onto when the ground feels uncertain. For functioning that sharpens rather than scatters when the stakes go up. That's not a small thing. In most people's lives, there is one person, and sometimes only one, who can hold steady when everything else is moving. And that person is almost always someone exactly like this. The calm you bring to difficult moments is something real. It's something people have relied on, probably without saying so nearly enough. It's worth understanding, not just as a useful trait, but as part of who you actually are. So now I'm curious, are you someone who tends to stay calm under pressure, who gets clearer and more focused when things go wrong, while others around you unravel? Or are you more the opposite, someone who feels the emotional weight of a crisis immediately and moves through it that way? Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever felt like being the calm one meant people forgot to check on you, I'd genuinely like to hear that too.